just quickly, the title of this panel session is called Mobility Blues. I really want to discuss what are some of the existing and foreseen challenges still lying ahead relative to mobility, both connected and automated, but really focusing primarily on level 4 and 5. How do we actually get to the point where we can practically deploy these vehicles for everyday use? Our panelists include Sue Bai. Sue is a chief engineer in Automotive Technology Research Division at Honda R&D Americas. Our areas of research include wireless communication for in-vehicle navigation systems, telematic systems design and development, and connected and automated vehicle systems research. Our second panelist is Raymond Hess. Raymond is the transportation manager for the city of Ann Arbor, where he works in areas of land use, economic development, public management, and transportation to improve livability, promote sustainability, and make a stronger community here in the city of Ann Arbor. Next is Ram Vasudevan. He's an assistant professor in mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan. Ram has worked extensively with developing automation for both passenger vehicles as well as delivery vehicles, or ground drones, as some people refer to them. And last but not least, Steve Vozar. Steve is principal and founder of Vozar Technologies Consulting, where he offers strategic insights and technical leadership to help develop products and services leveraging autonomy, artificial intelligence, robotics, and Internet of Things. Prior to his consulting gig, he was a co-founder of May Mobility. So with that, I want to welcome our guests, our panelists, and thank them for their time this morning. I want to start off with a couple of questions just to get things going, but please, if there are questions that you also have or comments you want to make, please interject. When do we think that we'll get to the point where, or how far are we from what the general consumer thinks of automated vehicles, or highly automated vehicles, and where we are technically? I think that there may be a mismatch between the expectations of the general public and where we are, at least to date. So I wanted to open that up. Maybe I'll start, Ram, with you. What do you think are the big discrepancies between what the average person thinks and where we are? Oh, I think you're on mute.
There you go. Hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, and thanks for the invite, and thank you for everyone for arranging this. This is really cool that we can do this via Zoom. So I think that the consumer at the moment really has sort of an optimistic outlook on where we are as a community in automation. That is, I think they think we're fairly close, and I mean, to be totally blunt, I think we're not very close at all. I think there are versions of this technology that make sense, that I think we can do versions of autonomy or semi-autonomy that I think are deployable currently and are deployed on the roads at the moment. But I think maybe the sort of Jetsons perspective, maybe dating myself a little bit, but the Jetsons perspective of autonomy is not quite there, or will not be there for quite a bit of time, meaning having a system that can be deployed, for instance, on an Ann Arbor road in the winter and can operate fully autonomously across a variety of different weather conditions without being geo-fenced or weather fenced, et cetera, is probably not close at all. So, I mean, I think optimistically putting that, at 10 years out is probably, me as a researcher being really, really hopeful. And as a pragmatist, I would say is probably much further out than that. But that doesn't mean that we don't have versions of autonomy that I think can be useful today, deployed on the road. So, I mean, I think things like delivery robots that have versions of autonomy, meaning where they're teleoperated sporadically through difficult intersections, exist now, and I think have a potential roadway to being, or pathway to being a broadly deployed successful business case exist at the moment.
Sue, from a manufacturer's perspective, although not necessarily speaking for Honda, dealing with consumers directly as the manufacturer, what are your thoughts about the separation between what the general public thinks and where we are.
I enjoy the question, the way you asked, what's the gap between the expectation and technology? I think we probably should separately look at the consumer's desire, which is set typically by the consumer, safer, more efficient, enjoyable. The expectation is probably have a lot to do with the manufacturer, infrastructure providers, along with legislation entities to set. So if there's an overhype on expectation, I think we should all take some share of a responsibility on how do we set the right level of expectation. And similar to Ram's comments, I think the technology is rapidly evolving, but we're not there yet. Taking example of connectivity, this connected vehicle features creates a very new area for probably for the first time in human mobility history to allow cars to exchange their intentions. For example, instead of people giving middle finger gestures, there's a better way to communicate to avoid a lot of misunderstandings and road rages, which could result collisions. And these are fascinating technologies that I think the consumer probably needs to be more educated to understand the technology is step by step evolving. It's not overnight. Everyone will not be driving. And there are people also like driving. How to exist a mixture of automation and some flavor of human driving and a level 2 that's somewhere in between. These are still being resolved. It's not going to be resolved overnight.
Thanks. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Sure, I think I'd agree with what Ram and Sue are saying, and I think the difference in expectations between the state of the technology and what consumers think. I think there's this idea of like, when will we have highly automated vehicles? And I like to think of it more as, where will we have highly automated vehicles? There are places, like Ram said, where these vehicles are being used, and even in highly structured environments like warehouses, they've been used for 5 years, almost 10 years now. And so we're just building up the operational design domain to more and more complicated environments, but it's going to take a long time. And so as we start to introduce more and more uncertainty into the design, into the domains that we want to use these vehicles, it gets more and more difficult. And so you can start to see, closed courses, warehousing type things. They've been working for a while. Whereas going out into the open roads, we're sort of in a nascent, area with that. And then something like a passenger car. Getting ahead of myself here, but that will be a very long time indeed. And so I think people need to stop thinking that there's going to be this magic switch that gets, flipped and all of a sudden we have, self-driving cars everywhere. It's really going to be in a location by location, situation by situation basis.
So a phased in approach.
Absolutely.
So Raymond, being the lead for transportation in the city of Ann Arbor, I'm just curious. I've never asked you this before, but do we get inquiries from the general public about why hasn't the city of Ann Arbor deployed autonomous buses or other types of vehicles?
Yeah, we will get inquiries largely in response to some of the testing that people witness on our roadways. So when Waymo is on the roads testing, we'll get questions about that from time to time. There are some autonomous delivery robots, or as you call them, ground drones, earlier, Jim. And so sometimes we'll get inquiries about that. I haven't necessarily heard of a clamoring for it per se. I think there are some sustainability metrics and things like that folks are looking towards the electrification of vehicles, and most of the direction for this new technology seems to be on electric vehicles. So I think there's some movement there. I do want to note that I pretended to be a researcher and did a statistically significant survey of members of my household on this question. And my wife's response was that we already have such vehicles, but they're not working great yet. and that my 8-year-old daughter, her response was that we'll have fully automated vehicles soon, in about a year. So I think, to Ram's initial point about what the public expectation is, I think people see Waymo on the road, they see the delivery robots, they think the technology is already here, but there is a disconnect between that understanding of the 5 different levels of autonomy versus what's practical and feasible in today's environment.
Great. So kind of following up on next question, John Quant's presentation, which he talked quite a bit about the connectivity issue. Clearly there's a tremendous amount of effort and dollars that have been put in specifically to develop highly automated vehicles, most focusing on, the LiDAR, the image processing, vehicle-based sensor technologies. But the question is, how much has really gone into developing the operational environment? Steve, you mentioned, thinking more of it about as where are we going to deploy it, as opposed to when are we going to deploy it, and that has to do with the operational environment. What types of changes do we anticipate may be necessary to the operational environment in order to help facilitate getting to levels 4 and 5? Steve, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think most folks who are working on level 4 and 5, well, I'll say level 4 because level 5 is not really a thing. It's sort of like an asymptote that we're maybe going to approach. Humans aren't even level 5. I can't go anywhere without a map anywhere, anytime. If it's muddy, I can't do it. But I'll put my soapbox away for a second on level 5. But I think, most folks who are working on level 4 robotaxi, that type of application are really thinking that they're going to have to work within the infrastructure that we have. And so, working off of things that work for human drivers, really good road paint, good lane markings, things like that, less ambiguous, right-of-way types of things. But most folks that I've talked to in the level 4 space are really convinced that they're not going to be able to put a lot of extra work into the operational environment. Now, May Mobility did do that a little bit, and they still do. They put sensors out into the world, but they're not counting on the municipality to do that. They're putting it out themselves. And so I think there's sort of a notion that, like, whatever technology needs to be developed, it's going to kind of behooves the company who wants to put it out there to develop it for themselves. And there are, constraints with that, and there can be conflicts. Like, if you want to have multiple operators in the same area, they do need to talk the same language. Otherwise, you're going to have 20 different boxes on the same light post or on the same traffic pole, and you don't want to have that. So we're sort of in the Wild West phase right now, and so it's time to start thinking about how to consolidate and how to have those standards. I think DSRC or 5G is a great place to start, but I think there's been sort of a slow to spin up on actually making that implementable and for people at the speed that folks who want to deploy are looking at. And so that's why you're seeing these companies go out and say, well, we'll just deploy what we can for now and wait on the standard to come.
Ram, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think on one axis, certainly automation becomes a lot easier if, for instance, we just don't have anyone else driving on the roads and we're just a fully automated world, and we can build a dedicated highway, for instance, for just autonomous vehicles and just remove humans from sort of accessing this, so it looks sort of like a dedicated sort of train-ish system. I think the problem is, to Steve's point, to everyone else's point, I think the challenge here is that getting sort of a central authority to step in and take ownership over that and spend money in a way that would make that tenable is difficult at the moment. I think there is a suspicion by the public and maybe a skepticism by most people that there is enough money to and maybe enough of a windfall from doing this type of automation to put in all the money we would need to be able to do this type of centralization, et cetera. So, for instance, if we're thinking about deploying a bunch of LiDARs and modems, et cetera, and building the infrastructure out. I mean, it would be, sort of like the federal highway system, was in the 50s, a really big federal project that would require lots and lots of investment that, I just don't know if we as a country at the moment have that kind of backbone to support that kind of development. Now, it would, on one axis, make a lot of automation much more straightforward. If I could reliably trust on connectedness to detect a vehicle that was, maybe occluded by a truck, and I know that that vehicle existed, and I could make decisions by relying entirely on connectedness rather than some sort of inference engine in order to, detect that that object existed. I mean, that would be incredible. I think it would make a lot of our challenges in automation science more straightforward. But I think at the moment that doesn't exist. And so fortunately or unfortunately, that has provided us researchers with a lot of interesting problems that we want to try and solve. That is trying to get, these types of systems behaving as robustly as humans behave, or we think they behave. But that may not necessarily be the cleanest way to resolve, bringing automation to bear. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in. I think it certainly provides us with a lot of interesting challenges, but it's unfortunate.
Raymond, do you wish to comment on from a municipality's perspective about the overabundance of funds available to invest in such infrastructure changes where they deem it?
You got me, Jim. We're just sitting on piles of treasure, not knowing what to do with it. Yeah, I mean, to build off of Ram's point, I completely agree with his perspective on this. I go back to, I think it was back in 2009 when the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices was updated, and there were kind of new standards for signage related to retroreflectivity and the different types of lettering you can use on street signs. And I remember when that happened, municipalities kind of freaked out because it's like, wait a second, we have to change every single sign in our system to meet these standards. And there was a shot clock. There was a timeline in which municipalities had to actually implement that, which ultimately was backed off of. And I think that's going to be the real challenge, is if there is expectations for municipalities to provide some of this infrastructure above and beyond what's already out there, you're going to have a wide spectrum, just a widely varying degree of implementation across different communities. And so, I'm sure the OEMs are not going to want to rely exclusively on that infrastructure, right? That maybe Ann Arbor is really well connected, but maybe the next municipality over isn't. And it's not like the car is going to, stop working in that instance. And I think the other point that Ron brought up that is worth kind of highlighting is this kind of in-between phase is going to be really awkward, until there is some sort of critical mass where you can start to identify when, where, and how truly autonomous or highly autonomous vehicles can operate. When you have kind of this mix between, the highly autonomous vehicles and, human drivers, it's going to be kind of an interesting relationship to see how those different operators work in a shared environment. So I think that's where, as a municipality, we kind of struggle where, we obviously are trying to put in infrastructure that supports these things. The university has been a great partner and has really helped, procure funding and done some research around this space. But without kind of the university's help on that, I doubt the city would really be taking a lead. We would be much more in a reactionary mode.
Okay. Sue, do you any comments on that question from the manufacturer's perspective?
This is one of my favorite topics. I think we should go back to why are we developing automation and connectivity. The ultimate goal, at least for Hunt as a safety researcher, is a safety, collision-free society. And then there's a mobility for people in need, efficiency, the joy of mobility. Those are also tied with the ultimate goal. We take an example of Honda's initiative of building a smart intersection in Marysville, Ohio. I doubt how many people in the audience know where it is. It is where Honda R&D North America located. Marysville is a small town, about 15 miles away from the R&D facility, right in between Dublin and the TRC. We started working with the city to show this connectivity can help safety and also automation. The concept is using camera sensors to detect approaching vehicles from 4 approaches in one of the busiest intersection in Marysville. And then there's a roadside unit broadcasting these approaching vehicles and pedestrians information as if they all have a transponder. And if you have the connectivity equipped in your vehicle, when you drive into this intersection, you literally see the future of what happened in 10 or 20 years when most of the vehicles have this connectivity. And this is where I often make an analogy of we're seeing the Amazon.com in the 1970s right now. Knowing what the future is, I think it really, this would energize the infrastructure and the manufacturers and the legislatures to push this technology forward together. What we've seen is once we finish the first prototype of the smart intersection, we've seen other OEMs, other technology companies coming into this in the middle of a rural area, small town, to start putting more technologies in there. And the city government is extremely easy to work with. I'll give you an example. One day we were testing, we saw, wow, that roadside unit is broadcasting something that's not to our spec. Within 10 minutes, the roadside unit was fixed, and we were able to continue the testing. And the words went out, Ohio DOT, Union County, they are all very supportive. With that very friendly and highly efficient environment with highly motivated people, both from Honda and from local government, we were able to expand this Marysville little concept to several different intersections, and eventually the entire Marysville city that has 27 intersections will all be equipped with some level of connectivity. And then Ohio DOT is continuing to build their corridor to be a fully covered end-to-end connected corridor, probably the longest, at least in the US. And yes, there are roadblocks, there are things slowing down, there are FCC, but I think if people really have this passion to deploy something to save people's life, we can make it happen.
Great, thanks. John Quant also touched upon, more than touched upon, talked about kind of the regulatory and legislative environment, and sometimes the states are ahead, for better or worse, in trying to establish regulations about things like automated vehicles and their operation in their districts, where other times, the industry's looking for guidance from the federal agencies, and so it's not as if the legislation or regulation is always in front of or behind where we are with the technology. What do we think are probably the biggest things holding, from a legislative and regulatory perspective, the biggest things holding back, ultimate deployment of highly automated vehicles? Sue, we'll go back to you.
Well, I think certainly the legislature has a responsibility on, again, going back to the expectation, what's expected and what's not, and the manufacturer's testing procedure. I'll borrow some of the work that from SAE's Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium, and these are public information that consortium have a group of manufacturers, including Honda, to develop some industry recommended practice on test procedures, ODD definition, and for people with special needs, and even for first responders, how the vehicles communicate with police officers, for example. And I think these are standards is one of the most critical area that needs to be addressed. And I'm glad the industry is taking lead for that, because we are responsible for these road these devices that's on the road. And with the standards, with frequently communicating with the legislatures and DOTs, I think we can all set the right expectation, both for us and for legislature and for the consumers, so that we don't have to have this endless debate of the mismatching on the expectation.
Ram or Steve, thoughts about kind of the state of regulation and legislation?
Sure, I can go first if Steve doesn't mind.
Go ahead.
I think the challenge has been, at least from a deployment perspective, that regulation has been pretty piecemeal. So I think each state, to its credit, most states have been working really hard to make deployments feasible by trying to build a framework and working with companies to figure out a way to make deployments plausible. So I think, to their credit, I think they realize that bringing these kinds of high-tech jobs to their communities can be a great way to drum up the economy and in a particular region, and these are exciting jobs and bring lots of interesting technological progress. So and as Sue was mentioning, safety, which is a non-trivial thing. I think the challenge has been that, basically the requirements in each state can look a little bit different. And I think that can mean that it requires some extra work to bring these technologies to bear. Now, for big companies, that may be less of an issue because, they have scaffolding to interact with these different municipalities and the different requirements, and they understand what that looks like. For smaller startups, that can be much, much more challenging. So I think if we can think about ways to create sort of federal mandate or federal requirements that everyone can agree upon to make deployments across the country feasible, I think that would certainly lower the barrier of entry and make it easier for researchers to interact with these companies, which I also think can be an important way to introduce additional safety requirements and understand the challenges of doing these types of deployments safely. I think at the moment, what a Refraction or what a Google or what a May Mobility or what a Ford or a Honda or a GM learn are all sort of siloed. That is, basically they learn something, and at the moment, without creating sort of a framework to share that information in a way that we all agree would be useful, it can be really hard for us to understand how close or how far or what are the important challenges. And I think that, again, from going back to your first question, Jim, from a public acceptance or public learning about where we are, I think, the people on this panel may understand where we are and have a very pessimistic view, I would say, sort of taking the temperature of the room on where we are. But I don't know if that translates necessarily to the 8-year-old. And I mean, I think that's kind of an important thing for the public to understand as well. So I think building that kind of regulatory framework can address a lot of these different challenges.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Ram that sort of the piecemeal approach of state by state having different regulations and rules for reporting really makes it difficult, especially for smaller companies, to try to scale to different geographies. And that's why, you'll see, people concentrating in particular states that have favorable regulatory environments for AVs. But one thing in particular that actually took me a long time to figure out is sort of the subtlety into why that is the case. And so we say, well, we've got state regulators and they do something, and we have federal regulators and they do something else. But really, they're set up in a particular way, which is that the federal regulators, make rules about how things are categorized. Like, this is a type of vehicle, and this is a federal rule about how this is categorized. And let's talk about, federal rules about how roads are categorized and things like that. But it's actually up to the states, and it makes sense based on history that the states individually have the right to say, well, here's what it takes to be a driver on our roads. Here's what we want to say is acceptable for driving on the roads that we've built and that we control. And so automated driving sort of falls in the middle, where it's really more of a category of things, but you need the state's approval to get to actually drive on the roads. And so there is sort of this gap where multiple types of entities are trying to pick up the pieces. I've also seen municipalities trying to pick up the pieces and say, okay, well, we're going to make regulations on this. And so I would advocate that we should probably push more of this to the federal level, and have the federal government take more responsibility for defining the rules and regulations about highly automated vehicles, because the states simply aren't equipped to make laws that are sophisticated enough, I think, and move fast enough to keep up with the technology. Michigan and California and Florida and some other big states with a lot of resources and connections to the automotive industry, yeah, maybe they can keep up. But some of the smaller states with less resources, they're really going to have a lot of trouble keeping up, and they're mostly probably going to borrow from others. And I think that having a unified framework would make it a lot easier to have consistency across the state. So that's what I would advocate for. But yeah, just this particular peculiarity of why different states have different rules and why the responsibility is allocated such as it is does make it confusing for this particular use case.
Raymond, prior to your position here in Ann Arbor, you were in Las Vegas, and I'm wondering from the municipal level, Steve points out kind of what are the pressures or the challenges from your perspective?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Steve's perspective on this. Again, if we are truly going to try to create a network of infrastructure that really facilitates the operation of these highly autonomous vehicles, I think it needs to be kind of centralized. It needs to come down from the feds. It needs to be implemented by the states, because at the municipal level, it's very difficult for us to really anticipate what the future is going to be. It's more of a gamble, I think, at the local level. And quite frankly, in a lot of these spaces, especially at the local level, we tend to be more reactionary. I think right now, the operation of autonomous vehicles is governed under state law, same thing as it was back in Nevada. I think for the city to try to create another layer on top of that is not necessarily conducive, for the industry, let alone for us, right? We don't really have the bandwidth to be able to enforce such things. We've talked a little bit internally about, these new forms of mobility and where they belong on our city streets. So that's everything from, e-scooters, Spin, Bird, Lime, those sort of things. Do they belong on the sidewalk? Do they belong on the bike lane? Do they belong on the roadway? To the ground drones, right? These autonomous delivery robots. Are they in the roadway or are they in the bike lane? And I think we're really trying to take cues from the state in terms of how those vehicles are classified, and then kind of figure out if the existing infrastructure that we have at the local level is sufficient, or if we need to reallocate space in a way that ensures the safety and the mobility of our residents, visitors.
Okay. We have one question that came in. I'm going to hold some of the questions for the end. I'll leave some time. But if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. The next question I had for the panel was, what other difficult realities do we face in terms of reaching level 4, level 5 that haven't been discussed thus far? What other landmines potentially are out there that aren't getting enough conversation? Ram, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that again, because there's so much focus on the software around autonomy, I think the security aspect gets typically sort of swept under the rug, and I think that can in this particular autonomous vehicle landscape. Security can be a particularly peculiar problem. So I think some of it is sort of the typical sort of cybersecurity style thinking that I think most of us understand, or at least understand enough that we have passwords hopefully on all of our accounts that are hopefully distinct and good. But the security in this instance can also mean that autonomous vehicles can actually act, and connected vehicles can actually act in very malevolent ways that can create issues where they can behave greedily in a way that I don't think people have appreciated quite to the extent that they can potentially exist, which is, for instance, things as simple as, you know, if I move to a fully connected vehicle landscape or an automated vehicle landscape, you could imagine things like parking or traffic jams becoming a really, really serious issue in a way that, you know, benefits maybe this particular connected vehicle, but doesn't necessarily benefit everyone else, right? And I think those kinds of issues are, you know, seem secondary at the moment. I think as we move, you know, because people have sort of looked at this from a perspective of, hey, this is only happen if we have a fully autonomous vehicle on the road. But I actually think even in the connected vehicle scenario, we can have these types of issues become much, much more serious than we've given thought to so far.
So kind of it's possibly every bot for themselves.
That's right, and I think and every bot for themselves can certainly be a really terrible environment. I mean, I grew up in Southern California. Driving in LA is a sort of you know, they call it defensive driving. I call it everyone out for themselves. I mean, and again, that can make a lot of sense in terms of being safe maybe for yourself, but it can create lots of downstream serious issues with respect to traffic and other things that I don't think we're thinking hard enough about at the moment.
Okay. Sue, thoughts about things that aren't we haven't talked about that aren't getting enough attention?
Oh, I think there's one aspect of people with special needs, and they probably need autonomous vehicle more than a lot of other drivers with a full mobility capability. I'll give you an example. We were in 2017. The U.S. DOT Secretary Elaine Chao visited MCity, and at that event, I had a privilege to meet with Mr. Mark Riccobono, the president of a federation, National Federation of Blind. And through the conversation, I was so excited about the V2P program and how to build a prototype we showcased at the MCity opening several years ago. And then I suddenly realized I'm facing Mark. He's blind, but he doesn't give me the impression that he can't see me. He's fully aware of even the hand gesture, I think my facial expression. I feel he can see me, even though I know physically he can't. And at the end of the conversation, I shook his hand, and he knows exactly where my hands are. And he grabbed my hand. We had a normal handshake. I was just astonished at how little I know about people with a vision difficulty. That we were assuming this technology would address their needs, but I am kind of feeling we need, at least as a researcher, we need to dig a lot deeper on exactly what their difficulties are and how capable they are to design a product that accommodates people with special needs when we actually understand their needs, whether it's a hearing, cognitive, or vision impairness. I think those are the people who really need mobility, and we should pay more attention on that.
Or people with direct mobility issues.
Of course, yes.
Confined to a wheelchair.
Agree, yes. And we shouldn't assume we know their needs. And at least from my experience, I learned that the nicer way, that we don't fully understand. We shouldn't assume that we know.
Yeah. Steve, landmines?
Yeah, I think my landmines are sort of at the intersection of what Raman and Sue said, which is that just accessibility in general. And there's accessibility for folks who may be mobility impaired or have disabilities. There's also accessibility for people who don't have the financial means to benefit from highly automated vehicles. I mean, these vehicles are expensive. They cost a lot of money to build and deploy. Yet some of the problems that, the biggest problems that we hope to alleviate, would help, those folks who, can't necessarily afford it. So helping people get to jobs who otherwise don't have transportation availability, helping people make their neighborhood safer, and making it more livable. And sort of the question is like, how do we focus and allocate these resources? Do we say, okay, well, we're going to focus on building an individual vehicle for an individual consumer, and put all our eggs in that basket, and then, you know, sort of the people who can afford it can have this luxurious thing? Or are we going to try to make it a more utilitarian type of deployment? And if so, who's going to pay for that? You know, again, it still is expensive, but, you know, can we cobble together enough funding to make this something that is really for everyone to enjoy? And I think I'm not going to pretend to know where this quote came from, but it was sort of, you know, the mark of a good city is not, you know, how much you can get poor people to use, you know, private transport, but how much you can get, you know, the wealthy to use public transportation. I'm totally, you know, butchering that quote, but the idea is salient, which is that, you know, how can we make this accessible not only to people who you know, can afford it, but make it attractive to people who would not otherwise use public transportation, and people who really need it alike. I think that that's a real challenge, and it's not addressed exactly by just having automated vehicles. There's so many other aspects that need to go into deployment that is really interesting, and we don't really have a great solution for that.
Yeah, that's a great lead into Raymond. Raymond, your challenges, the pitfalls?
Yeah, I have a couple top of mind, and I'll build off of Steve's, because I think that was one of the ones I really wanted to talk about too, is, you know, in a sort of utopian vision, you know, mobility becomes, you know, cheap and free, and everybody has access to go to where they need to go, despite, you know, their age, their income level, their ability, whatever the case may be. And I think, you know, there is some promise that, you know, highly autonomous vehicles can help realize that vision. I think a counter dystopian view is more, you know, that there was what I was going to cite is a book came out last month called The Velvet Rope Economy. I haven't read it yet, but, you know, my understanding is it really talks about how we're continuing to, you know, incentivize, you know, or they're just hidden economies that really, the haves have greater access to things, right? So if, for example, I think Ram gave an example of if, you know, if we have dedicated lanes on freeways for highly autonomous vehicles, well, who can afford to have those vehicles, right? Who can afford to have the, you know, vehicle that drives by itself and own and operate it themselves? And that sure looks and feels like, you know, the upper echelons of society. So I think that there are kind of two ways this can shake out, and it'll be interesting to see as a society how we make sure that people aren't left behind, that we continue to serve all people within our community, all of their ability levels, and all their mobility needs. Something that's top of mind for me right now as I'm teleworking, I ran around the house before this video conference and I unplugged Alexa, you know, told my daughter to get off her iPad, you know, stop screaming. I'm a little worried about just kind of bandwidth in general. You know, this Internet of Things, everything is connected from your toaster to your vehicle to, you know, everything in between. And, you know, at a municipal level, we are working with the telecoms to implement 5G. We're, you know, putting in fiber all in the city as much as we can. But it just becomes, you know, interesting to see how much bandwidth is needed when all of this comes to be realized. You know, the city's deploying smart garbage cans, right, that are connected. And so, you know, what is our priority for how we want to use that bandwidth? I don't think a lot of those discussions are happening right now. It is kind of a wild west race to just see, you know, who can kind of eat up the bandwidth that's needed. I think, you know, John Quant kind of talked about this as well when talking about reserving some of the spectrum. And so I think there's you know, some of that to figure out in the long haul as well. And then I think the last thing is really, you know, I think there are going to be other factions of society that are going to be disrupted. I think, you know, it looks like there's a session later called "Who Do You Sue?" You know, we're fairly litigious. The insurance industry is probably watching this space very closely. And so I think there are going to be a lot of other industries that are going to kind of shape and form this that are well beyond kind of the government spectrum or even the OEMs. I think there are other influencers here that are going to have a lot to say about how these things develop.
Okay. The next question I think I had was we've already pretty much addressed, but I just want to make sure I capture everybody's views, and that was, at least to level 5. And I realize, Steve, you said, well, there really isn't anybody working in level 5 right now. So let's say level 4. Getting to level 4. Based upon comments, this sounds more like a marathon than it is a sprint. And but I think there are other levels, such as delivery vehicles, where we can kind of sprint. It's maybe not the fastest sprint, but we're moving perhaps at a faster rate. Ram, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of spaces where I think we can move with a lot of the connected vehicle technology and autonomous vehicle technology that we've developed to deployments that are actually useful from a business perspective. And again, I mean, to Steve's point, I think these automated vehicles are supremely expensive. So like, it isn't just the fact that it's hard to build this tech. It's hard to actually build this tech in a way that is plausible for me to use, for instance. And so what I would say is, like, I think there are business cases, and as a result, technology that are ready for mass deployment. And as a result, it's looking more like a sprint. And I think we're seeing that many companies are trying to break into that space. And so I think delivery, like you mentioned, is one of those places where you can travel at lower speeds, which means that you bring in a lot of the sensing requirements to a much more tenable horizon. And I think you build less expensive robots in that case. And I think you're seeing a lot of companies try to do deployment successfully now. And I think given the pandemic and where we are with respect to actually being able to interact with the real world, and most of us are sort of quarantining, or a big portion of us are quarantining, I think it's a time that also illustrates that this technology may be ready for a bigger development, bigger deployment, et cetera. So,
Steve, any thoughts on that? Sprint or marathon?
Yeah, I think I would liken, I was trying to figure out an analogy that I liked, and I think marathon is not quite it, because it's a very competitive, and it's, it's not like at the end of a marathon, anyone could win as long as they, do the thing that they need to do. But this is sort of a marathon where people drop out. And it's almost like a presidential primary. I think of the Democratic primary this year, in 2016, the Republican primary. There were a lot of people that wanted to throw their hat in the ring, and it was very competitive. And there was a very, highly sought after prize, and you have to show progress in order to continue to stay in the race. So there's a lot of micro sprints so that you can stay in the race. You can get that next level of funding. You can get that press, but it is a marathon. You have to have enough gas in the tank to be able to keep going. And once you win, then you have this responsibility, to do a lot more. It's not like you can, just sit down and sigh a breath of relief, or breathe a sigh of relief. But I think it's more like a presidential primary. Honestly, there's these things that you have to do, and you have to do things on the micro scale to stay in the race. But ultimately, is the long term.
All right, I said I wanted to leave some time at the end. We have about 10 minutes. Leave some time on the end for some of the questions that came in. So one of the questions Ted Bailey asked, with ubiquitous level 4 being greater than 10 years out, why not focus on public-private collaboration efforts toward lower levels of automation, level 1, level 2? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I can jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I think level 1 and level 2, I think they're sort of here, which is interesting. Just to define level 1 and 2, level 1 is basically automated cruise control or lane keep assist. And level 2 is those two things in combination with one another. And so you see things like Tesla with autopilot, and GM with Super Cruise, and other companies have their branded version of level 2. And it exists. It's here. It can be improved upon, but there doesn't really necessarily need to be public-private partnerships, because that's something that can be done on each individual vehicle. It's not as the huge jump from level 2 to level 4, and I'll skip over level 3 because that's sort of a no man's land. That's also that's sort of a dangerous thing because of the handoff between humans and vehicles. But I think that the public-private partnerships for level 1 and 2 are not actually particularly necessary, in my opinion. You really, you need to get to the level 4 type of applications where you need to have even more collaboration. And that's why I think you're not seeing that.
Stu, did you want to comment?
Yes, I think we should come back to the ultimate goal of automation. It is to serve people, and safety is the #1 priority. If we always remind ourselves safety is what we should be focusing on most, with that goal, I think the level 2 certainly help reduce some of the human errors. And as the automation goes to a higher level, the goal doesn't change. And some of the technology, I go back to the smart intersection as an example. Those technology can be used for higher automation vehicles. It can also assist, improve level 2 vehicles. So these are phased approach that the technology would enable and assist existing and future technology.
I think, you know, one of the things that we've heard, at least from Michigan DOT, and we've been doing some work in the area, one of our faculty have been, is from the public perspective, you know, even though you have systems that will, you know, are level 2, you know, there are still some infrastructure requirements, namely there need to be painted lines, and what does the quality of those lines need to be? Sorry, I have a barking dog in the background. I told them to shut up, but they didn't listen. You know, you've got you know, are you going to have to paint lines every 2 years as opposed to every 3, every 1 year as opposed to every 2? And so, you know, there is still some lack of understanding, I think, on the part of the roadway operators, yet as to, you know, ultimately what their responsibility is going to be, and, you know, or how often do they have to replace those signs because they've gotten faded. So I think that there are some areas of private public partnerships, but I think there's still like ample questions out there. We had another attendee type in a question about what's being done to address barriers that people with disabilities have with using automated vehicles. I think we touched upon that a little bit. Anybody else, was there anything you wanted to add to that about disabilities?
So I would like to chime in on one example of the SAE standards that we developed called the J2945/9. In that message, we put specific data elements as an industry standard to specify if you were a pedestrian, are you riding a wheelchair? Do you have a vision, cognitive, hearing impairments? And we're asking the industry and stakeholders to help us to further develop that standards for all sorts of special needs. And again, the connectivity give a human and road users such a powerful tool to communicate almost everything you want to communicate. And people often think, do I need connectivity? I'm fine driving on my own. But we are actually communicating on the road. Taking one negative example is the tailgating. The tailgater is sending a message to the car in front, telling how unhappy he or she is towards the leading vehicle. These are communications, and that can be addressed much more effectively and safely. And on top of people with special needs, now they have a way to tell what additional spacing and additional time they may need. And again, I know so little about them, just taking the interaction I had with Mark Riccobono, and realizing we really should pay more attention and do much more in-depth research to fully understand people with special needs. What are their needs? What are their capability? And adding Jim's comment on people living in a less accessible environment, neighborhoods, how can we address those people's needs?
Great, thanks.
And Jim, if I could just add another thought to that, I think the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority, which runs our local bus system, has done some interesting pilots, not necessarily related to kind of autonomous vehicles per se, but really about what are some of the technological advancements that can be leveraged to assist people with disabilities. So, working with University of Michigan, there was an automated wheelchair securement system that was installed in some buses to, again, really help with kind of operations and serving people with disabilities. They also worked on an app that helps people with visual impairments correctly get to the bus stop at the transit station so that they understand that they're getting on the right bus. And so I think, and then there was a humanizing autonomy pilot as well. So I think, this is where the promise of some of these technological advancements is really kind of, positive, that we can better serve people with disabilities through technology and through various different ways, whether it's through autonomy or through apps and other forms of connected devices. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how these evolve over time and how seamless that experience can be for people with disabilities.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Alex asks, are the AV R&D groups and industry considering the integration of connectivity, CV technologies into their AVs, or would they rather envision AV core functions as totally autonomous, i.e. not connected? So I'm gonna start with Sue.
Oh, yes, Jim, thank you for starting with me. We Honda fully believe this connectivity is an essential piece of automation. I give an example of how much people need connectivity to make a safer and efficient mobility environment. We are communicating. Right now, we don't have a very effective way to communicate each other's intention, avoiding a lot of unnecessary tension on the road. And another example is a traffic signal recognition. There are technology, vision, and other sensors to recognize the color of the traffic light, but those the range can be shortened during inclement weather condition. The connectivity instantly can boost that range to several hundred meters long. Now the cars several cars will receive the same information, and they can react similarly to avoid pile-on collision. And these are the technology that only connect the connectivity specific technology that none of other sensors can achieve the range and the ubiquitous coverage 360 degree, and it's a cost effective. So that's why Honda believe this technology connectivity is an essential piece. And I think we are in line with a lot of other OEMs and the government entities. That's why we're working together to try to deploy this.
All right, great, thank you, Sue. So we're out of time, but I wanted to thank our panelists, Ram, Steve, Raymond, and Sue. Thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did as well.